it was really exciting for me to think about human behavior, to think about how businesses operate, and think about that intersection with public policy where you can really drive really important change. Since climate change is going to affect every corner of our society, it actually creates opportunities in a lot of different places. Because you're on that forefront, and I think also because of both the opportunity here for attracting the talent that focuses on technology, to think about your opportunities for how you engage the entire region. There's a lot of opportunity here to learn, experiment as an entrepreneur, and then to scale, and to potentially scale big time.
Hello, today we're here with Professor Joe Aldy, a professor at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government, and I'm a proud alum of that institution. We're so glad to have you here on Opportunity Miami. Welcome.
Thank you, Rod. It's great to be here.
Well, wonderful. Let's hop right in. Your work focuses on climate and the future. Can you start by sharing us a little bit, like what does that really mean? Where does that come from? And where's that body of work going?
So, Rod, I'm trained as an economist. So as an economist, we try to understand people's incentives. What makes them tick? What motivates them to do things? What motivates businesses to do things? And when we think about climate change, there's a lot of challenges there. We don't really have a strong enough incentive as an individual to reduce our emissions. Businesses don't have strong incentives to do that. For that matter, nations don't have strong incentives to do that. So part of that is to think through what are ways where we can bring our research and our evidence and our insights to craft more effective policies, to craft more effective institutions that can better align people's incentives so that they can be part of the effort to combat climate change. So a lot of my research in recent years is really focused on that, where we can better understand the risk of climate change, how we can then tailor strategies to address those risks, how we can evaluate how well those work. So part of it too, as an economist, you want to understand, here's a nice idea in theory, in the ivory tower, let's take it to the world of practice.
Economists, climate change, economists, climate change. How did you get into this body of work? That doesn't necessarily seem like a natural progression.
Well, so, part of it goes back, I grew up on a small farm in a family that loved being in the outdoors. I always had this affinity for the outdoors. And part of it as I grew was trying to think through what's the best way to harness that passion through, originally through my training in college, but then what could be a career where I could continue to work on these issues. And you know, there's different ways one can do it. You don't have to be an economist to do it, but it was really exciting for me to think about the tools of economics, to think about human behavior, to think about how businesses operate, and think about that intersection with public policy where you can really drive really important change. And so that's why I got excited to work in that space. And I think one thing that's exciting is that we're seeing, it's not just in economics, it's in other disciplines as well, but more and more economists thinking about how climate change affects their work. There are those who I like to describe as being climate adjacent. Okay. And in the past, they might not have thought that climate change matters for what they work on. Whether it's an economic scholar or whether it is someone who does economic development on the ground in practice, like you, right? And now you realize the climate's changing. That actually has impacts for the returns on the investments you're trying to attract here for Miami. It has implications, say, for an economist who might be working on, for example, international trade, because there's now climate shocks that are influencing trade patterns. It may be affecting how we think about economic development in a poor developing country, because climate change is a new stress on economic development. So you're seeing more and more economists thinking, how does climate change affect our research? Just as I think we're seeing in the world of practice, more and more people realize climate change actually affects what I do day to day in my job, even if I didn't think I was going to grow up and work on climate change per se.
I grew up in the 80s, primarily born in the 70s. This wasn't a conversation.
Right.
It really wasn't. It wasn't a conversation that was at the fore. The most I can remember is in second grade, there were these commercials that would come on and say, "Don't be a litter bug." That's about the most that I could think of.
You should also give a hoot, don't pollute.
Give a hoot, don't pollute.
Yeah.
That was our generation. I think there's a much higher level of conscientiousness about climate and impact with the generation that's emerging today. What are you seeing in terms of your students and how they're thinking about this work?
Well, the students are dramatically more sophisticated at their age about this issue than I was at that age. You see this, you know, it's for one thing, they're learning about it much earlier. You know, as someone who also grew up in the South in the 80s, you know, there was a time when I started to get interested in issues like deforestation in the Amazon. In the late 80s, we really started getting concerned about the hole in the ozone layer and how we were going to deal with that. So for one thing, we started to learn that there were these environmental events occurring that may be occurring far from us, but actually matter to our lives today. And I think started to draw more and more interest, and certainly, drew my attention. But otherwise, there wasn't anything in my elementary school or high school where I really thought about the environment. I thought about climate change. And I think now the students get that. I think they get that as well when they're in college. And so by the time they come to the Kennedy School, they've studied it a lot. A lot of them have actually been working on the ground after college before coming to the Kennedy School. So they're asking really important, very well-defined questions.
Yeah.
They've got a great foundation already from those experiences that you can build on, and it's exciting as a professor to train students who already have that foundation. Right. But it's also this thing, though, they know what they want to do to go make a difference.
So I graduated over 20 years from the Kennedy School, so we didn't have these exciting courses back when I was a student. You teach two classes, Energy and Environmental Economics and Policy, and Managing Climate Change Risk, Information, Incentives, and Institutions. Right. Can you talk to us about those courses?
Sure. So the first course on Energy and Environmental Economics and Policy exposes students to key questions in energy policy, air pollution policy, and climate change. And the goal of that course is to train the students to be a really thoughtful consumer of research evidence. There's a lot of talk about this or that in this world of energy and climate change policy and air pollution policy. Some of the claims are more rigorously founded than others, let's say. Absolutely. And what I want our students to be trained coming out of this class is being able to really distinguish high quality evidence from low quality evidence. To be able to, if they are in a debate about how to move forward on energy policy or to move forward on climate policy, to be able to challenge really suspect claims, to be able to identify the failings in the argument and being able to marshal much more rigorous evidence. And I think the thing that's exciting about kind of the evolution, as an economist, most of what I teach in this course draws from the economics literature, the revolution in both the empirical methods, but especially the data. We're able to tackle questions in the real world with our research in a way we couldn't a generation ago. And so being able to show them as well, like in the sort of revolution of big data, how can you actually produce evidence that answers the question a policymaker or a decision maker? It doesn't have to just be in government, it could be a decision maker in the business community. How do you take those data, do the analysis to address the question they have? Too often in the past, as academics, we might answer a question that interests us. It's not quite on point for the decision maker in the real world. But really the explosion of data and the sophistication of methods to enable us to say something credible about the causal impact of a policy. So we can say, this policy makes the world better because of X.
Can you give us an example?
Right, so one thing is I think we're seeing a better understanding of how reducing the air pollution from the burning of fossil fuels affects public health. In the past, we'd have a lot of these kinds of correlational studies, these associations. And there was always a concern that what you say, like, oh, well, pollution fell and people seemed a little bit healthier. Was it because of the pollution or was it something else I didn't measure? And it was a confounder, as we would say. Absolutely. So it may have been something I'm not accounting for in my study that's really causing that change in public health. And what we're seeing now are some really clever studies that enable us to be able to say critically, like, as we reduce pollution from our power plants, and we're able to really distinguish that it's the power plant regulation, it's not something else. We're seeing both a reduction in premature mortality. We're also seeing a reduction in the consumption of pharmaceuticals. We're actually saving people money. They're having to spend less money through their health insurance for medication for respiratory illnesses because we're making the air cleaner. And so part of this is, again, it's where you're being creative, leveraging high frequency data, leveraging data from health insurers that in the past wouldn't necessarily be all that happy sort of sharing it. But it's a really creative way where we can understand the impact of that kind of policy. I'll give another example that may resonate a little bit more here for Miami because it's about how we think about managing from flood risk.
Okay.
Working with a doctoral student, we looked at the construction of levees. The Army Corps of Engineers has built a lot of levees over the past century across the United States. And part of it is trying to understand who benefits from that. And we're using data where we know the property values of every residential property in an area protected by a levee. We also know the property values of every property just outside the area protected by the levee. And as it turns out, sometimes when we build levees, there's other properties that are made worse off, right? Wow. You build a levee, you protect some area from the water, but you're moving the water somewhere else. And we know how, because of the revolution in the data, we understand the hydrological and the flooding risk at a property level. Yeah. There's a group called First Street Foundations produce these data. We have property level data, and we know the value of those properties. So we actually are able to estimate in a really rigorous way who benefits. We can actually tell you how they benefit as a function of their income or their race and ethnicity because of the data that's available to us now, so we can understand the distributional implications of building these levees. But more importantly, how do we address these adverse spillovers? That's right. That there's someone who's just upstream or downstream of the levees now actually made a little bit worse off because we've moved the water towards them. So part of it is really explaining to the students in this course, here are the methods that produce, and the characteristics of those methods with the right data that produce really rigorous evidence, so you can make the most compelling, substantive case for improving public policy. The other course, Managing Climate Change Risk, starting point, the climate's changing. We're bearing adverse impacts from climate change now, heat waves, storms, what have you, forest fires out west. And so what are our strategies for dealing with that? And so we talk about ways in which we can enhance our resilience to climate change. We can talk about ways we try to prevent climate change by cutting emissions. Yeah. We even talk about next generation technologies, pulling at large scale carbon dioxide out of the air, putting particles in the upper atmosphere to block incoming sunlight. Okay. So we talk about those different strategies, and then we say, who are the decision makers? Individuals, businesses, governments who might be able to act on one of these strategies. And what's the information they need to act? What are their incentives for taking that action? What's the institutional landscape that can either enable them to act or might in some cases inhibit their action? And how might you want to make reforms on any of those, whether it's providing more or better information, changing incentives through public policy, crafting a new institutional landscape so that you can be more effective in implementing these strategies from combating climate change.
So here in Miami, we're seeing this topic of climate is front and center. Right. It's pretty much pervasive throughout our policies and our programs that there's this focus on climate. Can you talk a little bit about what types of opportunities in terms of careers are available in the area of climate?
Yeah, so I think the key thing here is, since climate change is going to affect every corner of our society, it actually creates opportunities in a lot of different places. I mean, you've already talked about this. Like, it can be in how we think about how we move. Yeah. Whether it's in aviation, whether it's how we think about innovations with vehicles. It could be a question about sort of how do we build up our infrastructure? How do we think about the building stock? How do we make changes? Just as in South Florida, you've had to make changes to your building stock to be resilient to storms. Yeah. You want to think about how to make sure that your building stock is resilient to heat stress. And so, but the thing is that because Miami is sort of, certainly within the United States, the front line of climate change. When we think about storm risk, when we think about heat stress, it's one of our large cities that's most at risk. There's a few others we can think of that have heat stress risk. But it's because you're on that forefront, and I think also because of both the opportunity here for attracting the talent that focuses on technology, to think about your opportunities for how you engage the entire region, not just South Florida, but how you are able to think about your engagement throughout Latin America. And the financial resources available to you, there's a lot of opportunity here to learn, experiment as an entrepreneur, and then to scale, and to potentially scale big time, right? And so that's the thing that makes that exciting then is that you're really able then to attract a lot of talent, because it's not just like, what do we do to help solve the problem for this one city? Yeah. But it's how do we actually come up with ideas that helps Miami, that then enables us to access much larger markets down the line. And it's that kind of potential for growth that I think is what makes this potentially quite exciting here. I think it's some of the challenges that Miami faces with flood risk that you already experience now, and with heat stress, that attracts people to be here to say, like, here's where I test out my ideas today. Those challenges create then those incentives to try to tackle the problem, to try to be creative in tackling the problem, and how you create those incentives. And to the extent you think about both working with the government and the business community can make it all the more attractive for someone with the light bulb going off over their head saying, I want to move there,
That's right.
and I'm going to go try to tackle this problem.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rod.